Hey everyone, it's Jess and we're back outside. Yay! I much prefer filming outside than in my bedroom because it's just so much more visually appealing out here. Guys, thank you so much for joining back again. It's Thursday and I wanted to do a video on one of my favorite succulents, which is the string of dolphins, which is this guy right here. Now, I've had to bring a number of pots with me because originally it was one string of dolphins that sort of leapt over to different pots, and it's just grown into this beautiful string of dolphins. Apologies guys if you do hear some watering. It's just my dad watering his plants at the moment. I wanted to do a care tip on this lovely succulent. I didn't realize, but I've heard that this succulent is actually a little bit hard to come by, I think in the northern hemisphere. The string of dolphins is a succulent and it is actually a hybrid. So it is a hybrid of the string of pearls and the candlestick succulent. Now, I've never heard of the candlestick succulent, so I'll insert some pictures here. But this succulent is native to the southwest of Africa. It grows by trailing over the side of the pots. It is also known as a soft succulent. Now, I wasn't aware that there were hard and soft succulents. Soft succulents are those such as the string of dolphins and string of pearls and string of bananas, where they're actually quite soft to touch. They haven't actually developed some hardiness and can withstand quite cold temperatures, as opposed to harder succulents. One of the most well-known hard succulents is the agave family of succulents. Now, these succulents actually can tolerate quite cold temperatures of below 0 degrees, which I found quite fascinating. But the string of dolphins is a soft succulent, which means that it can't withstand too cold of temperatures, and it's less resilient and less tolerant than some of the harder succulents. One of the interesting things about the string of dolphins is that it is a succulent that is native to Southwest Africa, where it can get quite dry, and so its leaf shape, that is its dolphin shape, has evolved to reduce the amount of surface area that gets exposed to the dry air, which I thought was quite fascinating. Another example, guys, of how plants have just evolved to suit and adapt to their natural habitat. An interesting fact about this plant is that as this plant gets older, just be aware that some of its dolphins start to look a little bit like manatees. So I've noticed that on my string of dolphins, the older bits of this plant, the dolphins actually look like stingrays or manta rays versus dolphins. But I've heard that actually happens with some older plants. So don't be too worried if your plant starts to look like there's a couple of manta rays there. Guys, I'm pleased to say that this type of succulent, I know it's rare in some parts of the world, but rest assured this is actually a very easy succulent to take care of, much easier than the string of pearls. Now, this guy, from a lighting perspective, needs some bright indirect light. However, I keep this guy on a shelf in an outdoor area and it actually gets some afternoon light. So most of its light comes from in the late afternoon, and I haven't had much trouble with it. From lighting, you want the light to actually hit the top of your pot, because hitting the base of the plant is actually going to help your plant grow. So you do want the light to be able to reach the top of your plant or the top of your pot where your plant is growing. Here's a succulent that does need light, so if you are keeping him indoors, just make sure you do give him enough light because he'll really need it. Whilst he enjoys light and he seems to be quite tolerant of quite brighter light conditions, you don't want him to be basking in the sun for the entirety of the day. Another thing with lighting is, if you want your plant to maintain compact dolphins, you want to make sure you give it enough light. Otherwise, your plant can become leggy, so the gap between each dolphin becomes longer and longer. So from a watering perspective, This guy is typical of most succulents. You don't want to give them too much water because as a succulent it can retain moisture quite well and retain water quite well. If you do notice his dolphins become quite mushy and yellow, that might be a sign that you've overwatered him. However, having said that, I have let this guy dry out a couple of times. Again, don't let your plants dry out too much because it's not good for your plant. He seems to bounce back quite well. I keep him outdoors and I water him once a week, and how I water him is I saturate the pot until I see the water drain out, and he seems to be doing quite well. I haven't really changed my watering schedule even though we're getting into winter now in Australia. However, I would say that I do keep an eye out on his soil to see if it's dried out. Whenever I see it's dried out, I just give him a water. He is quite a resilient succulent. He's definitely not as fussy as your string of pearls, which do tend to dry out if you don't water them enough, but these guys seem to do quite well. Another sign you can see is if his dolphins start to get a bit wrinkly, that's another sign for you to water this plant. From a soil perspective, this guy, keep him in some well draining soil. I use a mix of quite fine orchid bark mixed with some perlite and succulent mix. As long as you see your pot is quite well draining, really not anything too much to say about soil aside from the fact that you want to have a nice well draining mix. In terms of planting up or repotting this plant, the only thing I'd say is just be mindful that this plant is actually quite delicate, so his strings I find can fall apart quite easily, and so you just want to be quite gentle with him when you repot him, and also consider the type of pot you're putting him in. I've seen people pot this guy up in some hanging baskets, and I admit it does look quite beautiful, but I just think that if you do pot him up in a hanging basket, just be mindful that his little string can actually fall off quite easily. So just keep that in mind, particularly if you want him as a hanging trailing plant. Having said that though, he's very easy to propagate, so whenever I see a string that's fallen off, or if I touched it and I was a little bit heavy-handed, I really just pop him back into the soil and can propagate quite easily. I might as well talk about propagation right now. I've seen on the internet people say that to propagate this plant, you want to take a section of the string, you want to make sure that it calluses over before you pot him up into soil. From my experience, I've never really done that, though I'm sure that is the proper way to do that. What I've done is just pop him into soil and he seems to grow quite well. I also just keep him outdoors with the rest of the plant. I don't take the propagating sections into a more sheltered environment, although again I'm sure that's giving your plant the best chance of survival. But I think what that is a sign of is that's just a sign of how easy this plant can grow and how resilient it can be. The other way you can propagate this plant is of course through water, where you pop a bit of string in some water and you let the roots form. In terms of growing for this plant, I touched on briefly when we were chatting about lighting. You do want to make sure you keep him in a location where the light hits the top of the soil, because that actually encourages him to grow. Growing periods for this plant is typically spring and summer during the warming months. However, as we're going into winter in Sydney, I do find that he's still growing, and I can actually show you the bits where he's still growing, and I just think that's quite fascinating. Mind you, winter in Sydney might not be as cold as the northern hemisphere, although I think it's quite cold, but he seems to still be growing. So I think just keep that in mind wherever you are in the world, that your plant might go dormant over the cooler months. However, in Sydney, where winter can get to lows of about 10 degrees during the daytime, plant still grows quite well. So it might grow a bit slower, but from my experience it's grown quite well. I don't really fertilize this plant. I probably gave it a bit of fertilizer when I was fertilizing other plants, but I use a standard over-the-counter liquid fertilizer that I dilute to about half or a quarter strength, and I just pour it over whenever I have some extra fertilizer after I fertilize some other plants. This plant also does have some flowers. My plant hasn't flowered yet, but I've been told that the flowers are quite a nice pink color. From a temperature perspective, as this plant is native to the southwest parts of Africa, the average temperatures there are between 22 to 35 degrees. Of course, 35 might be a little bit too hot for your plant. Optimal temperatures for this plant is 22 degrees. I keep my plant outdoors all year round, including at night where it gets to lows of 6 degrees and he still survives. So I wouldn't be too worried from a temperature perspective. The only thing I'll say is this plant is not going to do quite well in frost. And so what you want to do is, if it does get really cold over winter for you, or it does snow, bring him indoors, because he's not going to survive a couple of days left in frost. From a pest perspective, from the internet, I've seen that this plant can be susceptible to mealybugs depending on the climate you're in. So I have seen some mealybugs on this plant. For me, sorry, my dad's pulling down a branch, so apologies if you can hear that in the background. This guy, I have seen a mealybug, and mealybugs tend to come out in more warmer, more humid environments. However, this guy is actually quite resilient, so all I did was take away that mealybug, spray a soapy spray on him, and he doesn't seem to have much trouble. The only other thing I'd say from a pest perspective is scale is often a very big pest for succulents, so you just want to keep an eye out for scale. I haven't seen any scale on my plant, thankfully, but that's another pest to keep in mind. Generally, these guys can be quite resilient and tolerant to pests, so don't be too worried. However, of course, with any pests, Dad, ahoy bong like but of course, with any pests, the earlier the detection, the easier it is to help your plant survive. The one thing to keep in mind for this plant is root rot. You don't want to overwater that plant, otherwise it will encourage root rot. The other way to combat that is to give it a well draining pot and soil, and also to keep it in a well aerated environment. So if you're keeping this plant indoors, just make sure there is enough airflow. In terms of troubleshooting this plant, if this plant you notice that his dolphins start to become a little bit more yellow and translucent, that is probably a sign that you've overwatered him. Vice versa, if you've noticed his dolphins become a little bit wrinkly, that is a sign that you probably need to water him. But guys, I hope you enjoyed this video. These are one of my cuter succulents. Most of my succulents are really string-ofs. So I've got a string of pearls, I've got a string of bananas, and I've got the string of dolphins. But guys, I hope you enjoyed this video. If you have any questions, the care tips, please let me know by dropping them in the comments in me DM. But guys, let me know of what you're thinking about this daily upload situation. Today will be day 11. Let me know if you want a particular video, because I've got about 20 days to go, so obviously I want to make things that you guys want to see. But guys, thank you so much for tuning in. I really appreciate it, and I will see you tomorrow. Bye.